This room full of judgy people was 100% correct to crap all over Dr. Victor Frankenstein, right? And I, as a professor who has accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant funding for my own research, I'm going to break down why. So the film begins with Dr. Frankenstein, Frankie, if you will, right, in a jury of his peers. And as a researcher, peer evaluation is everything, right? If every single licensed and credentialed person who works in your field thinks that what you're doing is ill advised, at least stop and listen, okay? Because for every Galileo Galilei, there are 100 Victor Frankensteins, you know? So that's strike one. But then, in a fit of some kind of mania that I am not qualified to diagnose, Frankie brushes off the peer review and focuses on the one person who's supportive of his work, this syphilitic arms dealer who is a relative of his. And now, to be fair, we don't know that he has syphilis at this point, but it is an important plot point. By the way, I'm spoiling the heck out of this. So when this guy, Harlander, offers Frankie the equivalent of millions of dollars in lab equipment and a research facility, Frankie asks him, well, what do you want in return, right? And Harlander does that vague, oh, one day I may ask you for a small favor thing, which is such a red flag, right? That's strike two. When you accept funds, right, you need to be very clear about what your half of the bargain is. That's what grant proposals are for. They serve as the promise of what you're going to do for access to that money. Then when Frankie asks Harlander where all that money is coming from, he finds out that it was made in arms dealing. And yeah, that's a huge ethical breach, right? But in fairness to him, I'm making that half a strike, right? It is ethically reprehensible, but somewhat of a gray area in academia, right? Where scientists are urged to accept grants from the Department of Defense or Department of War, I guess, if that's what you're going to call it, and from government contractors whose main sources of profit are wartime technology. Now, fast forward to the part where they're obtaining body parts for their research, right? First, they visit the gallows where people who've been incarcerated are awaiting public execution. Frankie and the arms dealer are examining these living people in their final moments of life, right? Strike 3.5. That's not how we treat human subjects. No IRB would ever okay that. But those bodies aren't good enough for them, so they hit up a battlefield right after the troops have cleared it. They search through the dead and dying veterans for body parts. And none of those soldiers had the opportunity to consent to their bodies being used in this way, right? Now, in fairness to Frankie, body snatching was a common practice at that time, and how many scientific advances that we could still build off today were achieved. But come on, that's ghoulish as hell. Strike 4.5. Now, once Frankie is successful with his experiment, he doesn't know what to do, right? It never occurred to him to think through that part. Strike 5.5, right? In all grant proposals, we have to detail what happens next. How will you dispose of or repurpose the equipment that the grant paid for? How will you share the results with the community that supported and financed your research? How will you safeguard the research results from the wrong hands? What is your risk assessment? How will you contain the dangers of your research and keep people safe from it? And when you're dealing with living or, I guess, undead subjects, right, you're expected to treat them well. You're expected to have a plan for their care in place. Even when it comes to animals, right? If you told your funders that you plan on chaining them up in a cold, wet tunnel with no food or plan for enrichment, they're going to withhold your money until you do better. Strike 6.5. And on that subject, right, you actually don't get to just splash gasoline all over your lab and set it on fire once you realize that you messed up big time, right? We've all had days where we wanted to, but scientific community really frowns on that. So strike 7.5. Now let's get to the quote unquote monster, who I'm going to call Victor Jr., right? Once Frankie becomes aware that Victor Jr. escaped the fire, he had a duty to contain him. Now, I'm not without a heart and soul, right? It became very clear to me that the monster's nature was not monstrous, but his nurture very much was, right? Dr. Frankie made that monster a danger to others. Strike 8.5. And twice, Frankie abdicates responsibility for this danger, right? The first time when Mr. Syphilis McWarcrimes falls to his death, Frankie blames the monster. Then, when Elizabeth jumps in front of the bullet that Frankie himself fired at the monster, he once again blames the monster, knowing damn well that even though he's the one holding the smoking gun, literally, right, everyone else there is going to side with the human over this guy, right? And of course, that's how it was going to go when he started his research, because he had no plans for the aftermath of his experiment. He had no intention of taking responsibility or facing consequences of any kind from day one. So that's going to be strike 9.5. Finally, when Dr. Frankenstein's brother dies, again, by something that Frankie himself put into motion because he is a disaster of a man, his brother tells him point blank with his last words, "It all came from you. You are the monster." Ah, indeed, indeed. So which do you think is the most egregious breach here?